Right, ladies and gentlemen, 2026 is actually a really important year for pretty much the entire world for those who actually want to pay attention. And the reason for that is because the official narrative on many, many things that occurred in 2025 and 2024 and previous years is all collapsing. And we knew for a long time that many individuals had been less than truthful with the type of things that they've been saying. But the chickens are really coming home to roost. And there's so many stories to talk about today. A lot of them are continuations from stories that I covered last year. And so I think they're really important for you to understand that when I talk about Venezuela or England or whatever, whether it be Israel or Gaza, what I'm really trying to show you is that you cannot trust the narrative. You cannot trust the government. Governments lie repeatedly. They tell you you must trust them. They are the only arbiters of truth. And yet, time and time again, they are the very ones being shown to lie. And I'm going to show you all of those lies today and how they're actually all collapsing. Now, before I get on to the main video of today, can I yet again remind you, please subscribe to the channel and help me grow to 200,000 subscribers. Anyway, let's get on to it. Actually, the first one is around the Tel Aviv Football Club. Now, if you watched my videos from last year, you will recall that Tel Aviv was banned from playing in the United Kingdom, specifically in Birmingham. Now, one of the reasons for this supposed ban, and I must say ban in inverted commas, was because according to the official narrative, the narrative pushed forward by Islamists in Birmingham, well, according to them, the reason that Tel Aviv had been banned is because apparently Maccabi Tel Aviv fans were violent and apparently they would cause a problem to the community. Now, many individuals noticed that really this didn't actually seem what the issue was, that it was just a pretext to banning them from going there. Many individuals that had like X installed on their phone noticed how many Islamist organizations had issued threats against Jews, because obviously Tel Aviv, Israel, Jews, and many were saying that the police had been weaponized for Islamist purposes. Now, would you know it, the Prime Minister even was drawn into this, and they had to comment on why Tel Aviv fans had been banned from football, specifically in Birmingham. Now, during the game itself, it was noticed many Islamists that were at the game attempting to cause fights with anybody who wasn't, well, an Islamist. Now, an inquiry was launched into it, and would you know it, the official narrative was a lie. Now, apparently, the West Midlands Chief Police didn't actually mention the real reason that he had banned people because he wasn't asked. In fact, you can see that right here.
Now, why is it that a report has come at lunchtime today from the Times newspaper that you had information on the 5th of September that there were likely to be vigilante groups within the West Midlands community itself who were planning to take action against the Maccabi fans? How is it that this committee is just hearing this for the first time?
Well, I think this is the first time specifically that you've asked for that detail. Well, that's what we tried. That's what we tried to get across.
Absolutely outrageous.
Now, Nick Timothy, an MP in the United Kingdom, actually addressed why these fans were actually banned from the game. In fact, you can watch that here.
Can you just explain to me the nature of this fabricated evidence by West Midlands Police?
Yeah, I mean, look, firstly, this is a really important story because this is about whether the police do their jobs without fear or favour, which is what the policing oath demands of them. But it's also about who has the power in modern multicultural Britain. Because I think what this story shows is that in parts of our country, it's actually the Islamists who are in charge and not the general public, and not not the elected government or elected councils. So it's a little bit complicated, but the chronology of this is really important. So Aston Villa drew Maccabi Tel Aviv, an Israeli football team in the Europa League, and that game was played in November last year. There was a big reaction from local Islamists, including there was also the local MP, who's a so-called Gaza independent, who wanted the game cancelled altogether. So there was a lot of pressure and a lot of worry that there might be sort of violence on the streets and that kind of thing. And at the first meeting of what's called the Safety Advisory Group, which is a committee of Birmingham City Council, the police told that meeting that their plan was to ban Israeli fans from coming to Villa Park. But according to the minutes, which we now have copies of, that decision was made, quotes, in the absence of intelligence. So then, a day later, the chairman of the committee wrote to the police and said they needed to find, quotes, a more clear rationale for the decision. Now, obviously, the rationale is supposed to precede the decision. In this case, the decision preceded the rationale. And then all of a sudden, by magic, by the 16th of October, the police went back to the committee and said they had significant intelligence to justify banning the fans. But the problem is that intelligence, we've got all the documents to prove this now, that intelligence came from an online call that the police held with their Dutch counterparts on the 1st of October. That is before the first meeting was held, when the first decision was made, supposedly, so they say, in the absence of intelligence. And also, the Dutch police have been absolutely clear on the record, talking to the Sunday Times and others, in saying that what West Midlands police have said about their experience when Maccabi Tel Aviv played Ajax a year earlier, that all of that was completely untrue.
Now, even Kenny Bradenlock has stepped in to say it looks like this entire ban was a cover-up, and it was a cover-up. And why was it a cover-up? Because according to West Midlands police, they actually capitulated to Islamists. They actually knew that extremists were planning an attack on Jews, similar to Bondi Beach, and their response was to remove the Jewish people and blame the Jewish people instead. In fact, even when they were approached by a parliamentary committee for oversight reasons on why they had done that, they lied. And the chief constable says the reason he lied is because he wasn't asked. It wasn't actually that he lied, he knew he was giving untruths or half-truths. So, what can I say? Apparently that's a good thing. But see, the problem was we all knew this to be true. I mean, you could immediately see the way that all the rhetoric was coming out online, that this was all the pro-Gazan MPs basically lying through their teeth. Now, talking of pro-Gazan individuals, well, according to the latest news, Israel has suspended 37 aid agencies operating in Gaza. Now, critics are calling the move outrageous and are accusing Israel of unlawfully restricting humanitarian aid.
Israel's suspension of numerous aid agencies from Gaza is outrageous. This is the latest in a pattern of unlawful restrictions on humanitarian access, including Israel's ban on UNRWA, as well as attacks on Israeli and Palestinian NGOs amid broader access issues faced by the UN and other humanitarians. We urge all states, in particular those with influence, to take urgent steps and insist that Israel immediately allows aid to get into Gaza unhindered. We remind the Israeli authorities of their obligation under international law to ensure the essential supplies of daily life in Gaza.
Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, that means that everybody now in Gaza is starving to death and they're all dying. Now, this ban actually came in on the 1st of January, and would you know it, no one's starving and the aid's still going in. I mean, it's almost like they were lying. Now, Israel's counter-argument says that the reason that they have restricted or suspended aid with these agencies is because of transparency and accountability. And they said that there are numerous instances where these NGOs that are going in and providing aid, well, especially given that aid is being delivered in a war zone, these individuals are not, should we say, squeaky clean, with some of them actually being strong jihadists, some of them actually being involved in jihadist activity. Now, Israel says that the suspended agencies collectively provide only 1% of total aid into Gaza. But would you know it, the UN has already issued condemnations of Israel because, why not? I mean, we're noting that the UN has said nothing about the unrest going on in Iran, but, them Israelis, they're terrible. Now, it's important to realize when I say that the UN has already condemned Israel, I mean all the way up to the UN Secretary General. But if you know anything about the UN, you'll notice that since 2015 to 2025, Israel has been condemned by the UN 173 times. And this is in contrast to countries like Russia with 29 times. Now, don't forget, Russia is supposedly the worst country on the planet, having invaded Ukraine. The fact that many Western countries have spent their entire national budgets to fight this war. An actual horrendous, murderous place like North Korea has only been condemned a whole 10 times. But Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, 173 times. It's almost like the UN is being run by, well, Islamist extremists, but, that's just an allegation. Now, it's important to understand why Israel did this NGO rule change, and it's actually something that we ourselves, I suppose, could learn from it, because there are numerous NGOs operating in South Africa, some of them, again, less squeaky clean. Now, after October 7th, Israel demanded that aid agencies submit full employee lists. Now, the reason for that is because it turned out that some of the UN aid agencies and some of their employees were actually involved in October 7th. Now, this has also followed allegations that UNRWA staff has participated in kidnappings and attacks in Israel itself, showing that these NGOs are, well, not non-aligned and they're not really there purely for aid purposes. In fact, some of them look like they have actually been infiltrated by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic jihadis who are using the NGOs as payroll masters in order to, well, facilitate them committing atrocities in that region. Some NGOs just flat out refused to provide their staff list, claiming that it would endanger aid workers. Israel rejected that argument, stating that unchecked anonymous individuals working in NGOs was enabling terror infiltration. Now, the BBC cited Israel's aid authority, COGAT, as reporting that these NGOs that were suspended have actually brought in no aid during the ceasefire. So they were only doing something whilst there was an active war zone. Now that there's a ceasefire, their contributions have been minimal, and that in itself is raising red flags. In a related story, the UN Secretary General condemned Israel for cutting water and electricity to UNRWA facilities, and he claimed that Israel had violated UN principles and immunities. But Israel says that the move followed legislation that revoked UNRWA protections. Now, Israel cites evidence of UNRWA staff being tied to Hamas, including hostage testimony alleging that hostages were held at UNRWA for the reasons why this legislation was passed. Now, the International Court of Justice has ruled that Israel must facilitate aid via UN agencies. Why they can't use other agencies, I don't know. And that in itself should be a question that you, dear viewer, should be asking yourself. Why is it that only the UN can be involved and they can't have other aid facilities, even though the UN is responsible for a very small amount of aid? Now, Israel and the US both rejected the ruling, calling it detached from security realities, because again, UNRWA staff have been tied to Hamas and have been shown time and time again to have been involved in the atrocities. Now, one such NGO who has found itself suspended is Medical Aid for Palestinians, a UK entity. Now, Israel alleges that MAPS, that's what the organization is called, that their Gazan administrative director is linked to jihadis. Now, that organization has refused to submit a full employee list, and Israel itself alleges that this refusal alone is what is justifying the suspension during an active war. You can let me know what you think. Should they be providing staff lists or not? But as we know, the whole reason for these aid individuals going in and out of Gaza is because they're all starving, or so I'm told. Now, the UN Special Reporter, Francesca Albanese, the individual that the Nelson Mandela Foundation says that they love to love, well, she suggested that the real death toll in Gaza could be up to 680,000 individuals. For a war zone where the population is like 2 million, that's like nearly a quarter of people. I think we know. The claim implies that 380,000 infants under 5 had been killed, despite that being like every single child in the entire region. You couldn't make this stuff up. And so you have to ask yourself, where did she get her degree in mathematics? And how is it demographically even possible that this could occur? In fact, it's frankly impossible. Possibly she got her degree in mathematics from the school of Jacob Zuma.
110. This is the number of days of absolute horror that the people in Gaza have endured. 65,000 is the number of Palestinians as certain killed, including of which 75% are women and children. In fact, we shall start thinking of 680,000 because this is the number that some scholars and scientists claim being the real death toll in Gaza. And it would be hard to be able to prove or disprove this number, especially if investigators and others remained banned from entering the occupied Palestinian territory, and particularly the Gaza Strip. But if this number is confirmed, 380,000 of these are infants under 5.
Now, this claim being pushed forward by the UN is yet again just another example of a narrative being inflated, which undermines the credibility of the UN. But as we know, many of these UN initiatives are actually being pushed forward by, let's call them celebrity activists, such as Greta Thunberg. Now, turning our attention then to Greta Thunberg and some of the charities linked to her. Well, Italian authorities have arrested 7 to 9 individuals for diverting aid money to Hamas. Now, don't forget that the reason we're talking about this is because the ANC says that their struggle for liberation is deeply tied to the liberation of the Palestinian people. And because of that, the ANC itself has deep ties with Iran and Hamas. Don't forget that we have a Hamas headquarters in Cape Town. Now, according to the Italian authorities, roughly 8 million euros in assets have been seized from these individuals. Now, the investigators say that 71% of donations sent to these NGOs have all been sent directly to Hamas, affiliates, or families of terrorists. 3 charities have allegedly functioned as front organizations for Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Now, the reason that this is important is if you watched one of the interviews I did last year with NGO Watch, they stated categorically that NGOs in Europe were being used to siphon off funds out of Europe in order to fund terrorist proxies in the East. Now, it's important to understand that the actual organizations that have been suspended or had their assets seized because of potential terror funding have all shared platforms with Francesca Albanese, the special reporter that the Nelson Mandela Foundation loved to host and says is just great, like she was the person of the year, according to the South African government. Do you know who else has also been linked to these terror funding organizations? Greta Thunberg. So what we are actually seeing here is high-profile activists now all being associated with terror financing. And this does bring a broader question of how humanitarian branding is being used to launder extremism and money, which again is another example of how the official narrative is just bogus. Now, turning our attention then to South Africa, let's then push forward to see what bogus bullshit the South African government is talking about today. So the first is going to be around the Venezuelan operation, and I'm afraid to say it's going to be that for a while until we have some kind of resolution on the issue. Now, if you watched my video from yesterday, you will know that I actually highlighted or summarized the charges that Maduro is being put forward for in New York. This is the reason he's been indicted. But according to Maduro, he was forcibly kidnapped from his home by US forces, a claim which the UN warns violates international law, particularly the prohibition on using force against other states' sovereignties. That's the heads of those states. Now, UN officials have stressed that human rights accountability cannot be pursued via unilateral military operations. But one notices that the UN does not get involved in anything. So the idea of a multilateral action against Venezuela is just never going to happen. In fact, we are seeing that all around the world, that when it comes through to the UN is a lame duck. It doesn't actually get involved in any of the conflict zones that need resolution. Now, Maduro appeared in the US federal court and pleaded not guilty to all the charges which I summarized yesterday. And he insisted that he remains the legitimate president of Venezuela despite claims otherwise. Now, it's important to understand that the reason the US claimed he's not the legitimate head is because he lost an election. And he disputes it. He says, yeah, I won, even though he didn't. Now, it's also important to understand that numerous countries around the world refused to acknowledge that he won the election because he didn't. But according to him, he remains the legitimate president. Now, that's actually one of the charges that he's being put forward for in the US courts, is whether or not he's the legitimate president. So he says he's not guilty. He says he is the legitimate president. Now, his wife also pleaded not guilty. Both have been remanded in custody. Now, in Venezuela, mass protests erupted, with protesters rallying against what they call US imperialism. Now, it's important to understand that when I say mass protests, I mean these are the individuals who are in government that don't want to see their positions threatened, because that's inevitably what happens in socialist states. But the population that have been repressed by the Venezuelan government are thrilled to see the potential end of socialism in Venezuela. Now, a caretaker government has been sworn in, and this is deepening internal political instability because the caretaker government is basically Maduro's parties and their individuals, or just continuing to hold the levers of power. Now, opposition figures have condemned this interim leadership while signaling possible returns to Venezuela, with many of them now suggesting that maybe they'll go back and fight some form of civil unrest in order to get the socialists out of government. And this itself is a problem because it could trigger civil unrest, economic collapse, and potentially forms of proxy conflicts, with refugees spilling into Brazil or Colombia, the countries around it. Now, President Ramaphosa publicly called on Donald Trump to release Maduro immediately. Although they've got to ask, oh, what, Cyril? I mean, what exactly are you going to do about it? Tickle him to death? Now, Ramaphosa said that the US action violates Venezuela's sovereignty and the UN Charter, and he positioned South Africa as a defender of international law and non-interference. Now, of course, one of the things that the ANC does not like is the US interfering in South Africa because they don't want to be held accountable for the stupid stuff they do. No socialist likes to be held accountable by anyone. And what you're finding is that because the UN is now being packed, and I mean completely packed, by socialist-aligned individuals, even the leader of the UN is a sworn socialist. What you're finding is that socialists do not hold socialists accountable. They all want to align and create some form of blockade against any form of accountability. And where we've actually seen this is out of the ANC Secretary General, who said himself that South African progressive socialist forces are all going to unite and fight against the US. In fact, you can watch that right here.
To this extent, we have resolved to work with all the progressive forces in our country and mobilize against the American imperialist aggression, including against our own country.
Now, the ANC echoed this stance that's being pushed forward now, and they condemn what they are calling US imperial aggression. It's always imperialism when another country gets involved. But the reality is that South Africa wants the rules-based order because it makes them seem somehow legitimate, even though, well, they're not. They're a small little player that means nothing. But you see, if they're all subject to the international law, then their economic might, which is shrinking by the day, their lack of governance, which is appalling, and their human rights abuses in their own countries all mean nothing because, rules-based order, which is exactly why this entire video is around the official narrative sucks. They lie to you, and the official order, the international order, can all go do one. In any case, the ANC urged the UN Security Council to intervene and accused the US of acting as the world police. Remember, Team America, world police. In any case, yes. What is the UN Security Council going to do? They don't have an army, they don't have any nukes, they don't have any political or military might. And in this instance, might makes right. And that is why the US will get away with what they've done. Now, political parties all are explicitly linking the intervention of Donald Trump to Venezuela's oil reserves, suggesting economic motives. And to be honest, there's probably a high degree of truth in that. Nobody's suggesting otherwise, and I'm certainly not suggesting that. Now, the Democratic Alliance sharply criticized the ANC and the government's response to the Venezuela. The DA accused the government of being politically selective in its outrage. They pointed out that South Africa did not take the same urgent UN stance when Russia invaded Ukraine, and according to the DA, this inconsistency undermines South Africa's credibility on international law. Now, Durka rejected the criticism. Of course they would, because remember, Durka is Islamist aligned, And they insisted that South Africa has consistently opposed violations of sovereignty, except South Africa has never, ever voted against Russia when it comes through to the conflict in Ukraine. The only time they did so was around kids and returning kids from Russia back to Ukraine. That's it, like once. They've never said that the invasion was wrong, and they've taken a neutral position on all of it. So the dispute exposes the deep fractures inside South Africa's coalition government between the DA and the ANC against progressive forces, against those with the brain cell. Now, talking of Donald Trump and his imperialist agenda, well, Donald Trump has renewed his interest in acquiring Greenland. So why Greenland? Well, he says that that stretch of land actually is the buffer zone between the US and Russia/China. And so he says that Greenland itself really should actually be under US control because it acts as a buffer zone. Now, currently, Greenland is actually underneath Denmark's jurisdiction, with Trump suggesting that he wants to acquire Greenland for US national security priority reasons. Now, reports suggest that Trump is even weighing military operations if Denmark refuses negotiations to give Greenland, or at least sell Greenland, to the US. Now, Greenland's Prime Minister issued an unusually blunt response, and he said, enough, Greenland is not for sale, Greenland belongs to its people, shut up, stop talking about acquiring Greenland, because Trump's been saying it for a while. Now, the reaction itself has been sharpened by fears that Venezuela has set a precedent for unilateral US action. And so Denmark dismissed the idea as absurd and warned that it would shatter NATO unity. And in response to that, many major European states yesterday issued joint statements backing Denmark and Greenland, saying that it belongs to them and hands off Donald Trump. Now, Europe reaffirmed that borders cannot be changed by force, even by allies, but it's important to understand that Donald Trump said he'd buy it. He didn't just say, hand it over. He said he would acquire it. Now that they're saying no, and that they're not willing to negotiate it, reports have suggested that he could resort to military action, but I very much doubt that he will. That's usually the whole alarmist because it's Trump, orange man bad. Now, NATO allies are stretching that Arctic security must be handled collectively, not unilaterally. But the problem is that many NATO allies are, not really very good, stable allies. Let's use the example of Turkey. Now, Greenland's strategic importance in terms of its missile defense, shipping routes, and rare earth minerals have all been highlighted as reasons why Donald Trump may be interested in that area. Now, Greenland itself seeks good relations with the US. I mean, obviously they want to trade with it, but its leaders stress self-determination as non-negotiable. They don't actually want to be a province of the US. Although we only know that from the leaders, we don't know that if that's actually the case from the individuals on the ground. No referendum to this effect has occurred. But what we can firmly say is that Donald Trump, during his reign, is attempting to counter the influence of Iran, China, and Russia by securing land and buffer zones that he deems as important to protect the US against these potential aggressors. And that's exactly in line with what I said in my videos this week. What we are seeing is battle lines are being drawn, the world is fragmenting, and parties are picking a side. In any case, that's just my views. Let me know what you think of all the stories in the comment section below. And until next time, bye.